welcome to Phillips Mill Art Talk. I'm your host, Laura Womack, and with me is executive producer Jen McHugh.
Hello, everyone.
Today, it's our special pleasure to talk with Phillips Mill Art Committee's 2021 honored artist, George Anthonisen. George is a sculptor who is no stranger to honors. He's won numerous awards for his art, sculpture competitions, has been the subject of a documentary film, has an honorary doctorate, and so much more. His work is on view at the headquarters of the World Health Organization in Switzerland, the US Capitol Building, the Jackie Robinson Museum, Walter Reed Army Institute of Research, several universities. George, I'm not going to go on. You can see his work locally at the Michener Museum of Art, the Doylestown Hospital, as well as the Woodmere Art Museum, and there's a large collection at the Berman Museum of Art in Collegeville. He studied anatomy at Dartmouth College of Medical School. He studied with the Art Student League in New York, and he has a BA from the University of Vermont. I could go on and on with his resume, but as you no doubt already know, it's his work that speaks most to his accomplishments as an artist. George's sculptures are, I think, universally figural. Is that right, George?
I would think so, yeah.
They show not only a sensitivity to the human form, but to the human spirit as well. His portraits convey his subjects' humanity as much as their physicality. And when you meet him, it's clear that the sensitivity he displays towards his subjects comes honestly from the man himself. Welcome to Art Talk, George Anthonisen.
Thank you very much, Laura. I enjoy being here and I am looking forward to the discussion.
Great. And we're very glad to have everyone in the audience join us. And we would love to have you ask questions of George. That's one of the special opportunities here on Art Talk. So please put them in the Q&A where we can find them easily. And George, let's get right to your artwork. Jen's prepared an extensive slideshow for us to explore. And we don't have a lot of time to look at your vast body of work. So let's get right to it. Okay.
Antigone, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Lots of people have thought very positively of this piece, and Ellen, my wife, primarily likes it, maybe the best piece, she says, because it has such life in it and such death in it, and the contrast is powerful. I don't know to what extent people know the story of Antigone, but she and her sister, Ismene, were in discussion throughout a play, and their uncle was the ruler in Greece, and there were two boys in the family, and there was a civil war, and the boys killed each other in the civil war, and the one who fought for the state was honored with pomp and circumstance, and the boy left on the battlefield who had fought against the government was left to rot. And Antigone and Ismene both really reacted strongly in terms of leaving the body that way, because if the body was left to rot, the spirit couldn't go on to the afterlife. And Ismene argues that we should wait until the storm cools and then approach the subject with the ruler, Creon, the uncle. But Antigone says we have to confront the ruler now. And the discussion goes on through the play, but the ultimate is that if the body is touched by anyone in the act of burial, that person will be killed. and Antigone is in the process, having decided that she in fact will bury her brother and sacrifice herself in the same motion. So that's what I've tried to put across. It's sort of a timeless concern in terms of action. And I did this after I had completed another piece that dealt with the same thing I set before you this day.
Right. So George, I think that there are a lot of themes of your work that are represented in this piece. Before we go to them, I'd just like to, Jen has put up 3 views of it. And also I think the maquette, is that right? In the upper left-hand corner, the white.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, so this is explain briefly what a maquette is, and then let's talk about how it differs.
Well, the maquette is the immediate understanding of an idea that is of real significance, obviously, to me. And I think it's really related to our time insofar as the Kent State sort of debacle, where students were killed. And there's a very famous photograph. And I sort of took that as a lead, and then I discussed it more within myself as to how I should proceed beyond the immediate idea. And I think that is like a lot of my work. I think I think in cliches frequently, like a lot of people, as I think about current events and everything else, until I start delving into something and really exploring the idea. And that happens not only in terms of a research and reading of a play or anything of that nature, but just the process of thinking about the idea as I'm proceeding to make the idea come to life.
So here you have her with her arm raised in the maquette, and it's sort of it's almost a warrior sort of attitude. And then there's much more
meditative sort of.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
In the maquette, it's an immediate action, spontaneous action, reaction. And I think in the finished piece, it's more a whole meditative thought on the subject. And I took it, I think things happen in the process. For instance, inevitably with my background, both being from a Western culture, unavoidably, what becomes connotative is the pietà and the concept of that sort of built in. And also the concept of meditation almost being Buddha-like. And I did in her hair styling, I did a yin and a yang sort of built into the piece. So it's sort of, in my own head, sort of multicultural, but at the same time, it's very specific to the life and the death that we have.
So we've got a classical subject matter related to modern political and human situation. It's sort of what,
Yes.
and that's what we're going to be looking at as we go forward, looking at your artwork. Jen's pulled up the Kent State photo that was.
Wow. Yeah, there it is. I haven't looked at that in a long, long time. Certainly powerful in and of itself.
It is, and you can see the relationship to the artwork.
Yeah.
Jen, let's look quickly at the artwork again, and then we'll go on to the next slide. Okay, so there you can see the influence and the result. All right, next up is the creation. And you were part of the, well, first tell us about this particular piece, and then we'll talk about the context of the Michener.
I don't know where to begin with that. I think I have always been interested in the cycle of life and in the family. And I think when I started this, I was also working with a concept of combining abstraction with traditional art. And this has, it's much, the picture here sort of flattens the sculpture out, but it's really much more ball-like. And it has the two sides, but it has three different images of creation.
There we go.
There you really see it. And on the one you have almost the Adam and Eve, and then on the other side is the Big Bang, and then when you have the hips of the female figure in conjunction with the ball that is taking development in the abstract piece, it's almost like a crowning birth. And that I would love to claim that I had imagined that and built it in, but it just happened. I was very lucky. So it's sort of, I was working with two images and I got three out of it. So that was a big plus for me. But it's one of my favorites, one of my two favorite pieces. But it has a sense of I think a quality that I've always again dealt with, is that I love traditional art and I've studied it very thoroughly, but I'm very aware of modern art, and I think there's great validity to a lot of the modern abstract art. And so that I've always felt that art that I did during my lifetime had to incorporate, both aspects. You can't leave one out and you can't leave the other out. One has to do with the time we live in, the other has to do with our history. And so I worked on several different pieces where I've tried to combine both consciously abstract and real, but then built in, I think in frescoes particularly, there's a more abstract quality that is a much more natural rendering and growth, not so consciously specific. And this was sort of a real fulfillment of that idea of the two aspects.
So this is just to make a note, this was part of the, as we can see here, the Rodin legacy, which was at the Michener Museum in conjunction with their.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was very pleased to be showing with Rodin, obviously. and Rodin and August Saint Gaudens were two major influences. I got a fellowship to study and be on exhibit at August Saint Gaudens, and so I was really working there, and so I could study his bas relief and his three-dimensional sculpture, and so much of his work, different from Rodin, really dealt with American history and civil rights. He did magnificent things of Lincoln. He did magnificent things of Sherman, the General Sherman, and certainly the 54th Regiment with Colonel Shaw and the black soldiers who famously lost their lives in combat. But his memorial is just magnificent. And then you have, on the other hand, Rodin. Oh, excuse me.
Sorry, go ahead. Please go ahead.
On Rodin, really dealt with the human figure and also maybe the tortured human figure, and also with the men and women in magnificent poses of intimacy together. And when I lived in New York, I used to go there at least once a week and study his work that was on view there. So they were indelible, and they to me are my sort of father images. That's an early Anthonisen. Yeah, that's right. I haven't seen that in a long time.
I wanted to put this up here, George, because I think it's just magnificent. It's not an image that we see often from you. And I thought maybe it would harken back to your, you're saying St. Gaudens and Rodin.
Absolutely. And Michelangelo, the male figure with Michelangelo. When I first discovered I could do this sort of thing, which was remarkable to me, obviously the first two guys I looked at were Michelangelo and not St. Gaudens, but Rodin. So, and those two obviously had an immediate influence on me. But what I also understood when I looked at their work, and I had a feeling in my bones that I was able to do portraiture almost immediately, and I could put down my ideas through my hands almost as quickly as I could think my ideas through. And it was the first time I had ever run into something I found I could do and do well. So that it gave me a sense in looking at their work that, if I were to work hard and I competed, and I've always been competitive, I could maybe do something of value. And that's where I sort of proceeded from. So
well, George, I think your accomplishments have been great, and I don't think any greater. You've had many illustrious accomplishments, but I think the piece outside the World Health Organization headquarters in Geneva is the piece itself is extraordinary, as well as the commission. Can you tell us the subject matter? Obviously,
it's a very important piece to me. I've done a number of pieces of this nature. This is called Death and Starvation. And again, it related to a time in our history, our immediate history, but certainly seems to be going on indefinitely. And people were initially horrified that I chose to do this subject, but there was a conference developed that was headed by Jimmy Carter, and it was held in Geneva at the World Health Organization to alleviate death and starvation. It was headed with Jimmy Carter, with Ernst Borgnine, who was a Nobel Prize winner for changing the period of the gestation of wheat from 1 cycle to 3 cycles during the year. And I have a letter that I'm very proud of from him about this piece, and they used it as the figurehead for this conference. And but it came from my understanding of the starvation in Biafra, and then in Ethiopia. And Ethiopia is the one that spawned the conference in Switzerland. So I've done other subjects. My daughter said it's sort of my Pandora box. And she said that maybe the Antigone is at the bottom, the subject of hope. But I've done one on drugs, one on murder, and I've just been working on a piece on injustice. And so this sort of fits with that. And they're all sort of counterpoints to a pretty optimistic perception I have of humanity, built on the concept of the human family and my own individual family and how fortunate I've been. So that I have had the feeling that if I only did very idealistic, wonderful concepts of family and humanity, I could be viewed as simply a pie in the sky kind of guy. And so these are a counterpoint. And they emerge because I can get so angry when I see the results of these things. But it's a good thing to have done.
Well, let's take a look at some of your work on family, George. While Jen pulls that up, I know you've done portraits of each of your family members. This is dialogue.
Yeah, this is I started the maquette of this piece is a mother really with two children, and she has a book in her lap and she's reading to them. But what happened is I took the book out away, and it's almost as if they may have been reading a book, and I should have left the book closed or something there. But it's the two children are obviously conversing together, and the mother is in a position of listening, and with the idea that she can monitor and consider what's being said. I think the ultimate feeling is the security of the children within the arms and feeling of the mother. And I think that sort of security allows for people to grow and to explore and to take chances with their own lives. And when that's lacking, I think it really curtails humanity in terms of that whole aspect of exploration.
I think we have another family ensemble to look at. Are any of the, to me, I see your family, your family's individual faces in each of these works. Are we looking at people we know here, George?
Not really. So they're always in the back of my mind. They're always with me. I'm a pretty secluded guy, and I live with them and I see them grow and go. But this is Generations. It's called Generations. And the elder figure is above, and it's a pretty obvious configuration. And again, I was sort of working with modern and traditional imagery. And when one thinks of the Henry Moore sculptures and the holes through, and yet with a certain degree of humanity through the figure that he always used. And then what I've done here, obviously, is use very realistic renderings of humanity. And I think the hand sort of symbolic is of a gentleness. It's the contained sort of growing of a baby, and also the growing meaning encountering and being aware of the tradition from which he comes or she comes. And so it's something I continually am thinking of and working with. I have great pride in where I come from and who were my parents and grandparents and so forth. And also the Western civilization I come from, I'm very proud of. It's a capacity for incorporation.
George, you've talked in the past about the fact that you were dyslexic and you were uncomfortable in school with subject matters. And yet, I forget who said it about you, that people who are dyslexic often have a sort of a storytelling capacity or sort of a holistic and sensual approach to things. And just listening to you talk about the family in that last image sounds like that person's right on. What do you think?
I agree. I think for myself, it's interesting because I think quite unconsciously, again, I was very fortunate. My mother spotted my dyslexia early on, and so I could get help for it. But and the help that I got was an interesting kind because I was under tutelage and I was told that I had to write a paper every night. It was like a what do they call it? A lawyer's pad, sort of line pad. And I had to write a page of that every night. And when the teacher that I was with would go over it, she was going over corrections of spelling and whatnot, and rules, I before E except after C and whatnot. But what they were really doing was saying to me, don't let your inability that you see when we mark it all up prevent you from thinking and developing ideas and thoughts. So I was equipped to move forward. And I think as one moves forward, when with any sort of, I think, abnormality of that sort, and I think we all have them one kind or another, you make compensations. And compensation has, I know, I have a remarkable visual memory. And I relate, rather than reading a sign, I'll relate to a sign and automatically try to figure out visually what I'm being told through the sign. And then secondarily, and if it's a road sign, I'm usually by it by the time I understand the written message. But yeah,
Also,
no,
all
that's
sorts
all.
of learning and thinking pathways.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Totally different.
Jen, we have a question from the audience. Let's take that before we look at some more artwork.
Okay, we have, well, first, Jim Feld said so much compassion and so much talent. Thank you. And then Laura Robinson wanted to know if you have your own foundry, George.
I've moved from foundries to foundries, and that's always difficult. The most recent foundry we have is in Philadelphia. There's two very well-known good foundries. I haven't been to one, but I've been to the other. And before that, I was in several different foundries, but I was with Talix for, I think, close to 30 years or more, 30, 40, whatever, a lot of years. But when they got sold, we had always kept our molds and plasters at the foundry because we were always in a position where we might recast a piece. And we were told we had to move everything out. And Ellen and I and Daniel, our son, rented a van, and we were transporting molds and so forth. And we built a shed in our backyard close to my studio, and we just filled it up. And so now when we go to a foundry, we go with the idea that we will keep our mold and bring it back after the process of casting.
So George, let's talk about the process a little bit. Let's go backwards a little bit about how that process works. Here, Jen has put up a picture of you in your studio, and there's some figures there that we'll talk about later. But describe for us a little bit, just a brief outline of how you accomplish these works.
Well, first of all, the picture Jen posted is flattering because that really is it's my studio is the size of a 2-car garage, and this looks enormous. But it's been very adequate, and everything I've ever made, I've built here. And my process simply is I model in plasticine clay, which is an oil-based clay rather than a water-based clay, because it stays fresh of itself. It doesn't have to be moistened at the end of the day each day. So I model my clay to the point where I no longer can hold an edge in the clay because I like detail. And then at that point, I cast in my studio from clay to plaster Paris. And then in plaster Paris, I'll work with files and I'll work with chisels, and I'll work in order to get the detail in the piece that I want. And once I've accomplished that to the best of my ability, I'll take it to the I'll try to sell it, because I have to have a sale, because the whole process of casting into bronze is so expensive. So that if I get a piece cast at the foundry, we take it at that point. I had a wonderful experience with a client who bought a lot of my work, and is a wonderful human being, he and his wife. But he asked to go to the foundry with me, and he drove up, and he had a ball. He really loved it. But I was in the process of casting Antigone, and at the end of the day, he looked at me and he said, "George, I've never looked at a sculpture for 2 hours at a time in my life." But on the other hand, he said that, to see the whole development of and process of a foundry is very, very valuable, particularly in understanding why the price of a sculpture is high, because of this really intricate but interesting process.
And also
I could go into the process, but I don't know if that's necessary.
well, maybe we can work on that for the future, George. Now let's take a look at your some of your frescoes. What do you think?
Great. That's yeah, that's a good choice. Again, family, and that's an early fresco, and that's a cast piece of hydrostone. It's very, very heavy. It's about 2 feet by 2 feet. And what I was doing, really, it was generated by necessity in terms of starting a fresco. There were 2 things happening. I was going very, very shallow in doing bas relief, but then I started getting interested in drawing into the piece. And so I started really drawing and sculpting in bas relief, sort of in combination. And then I said, what the heck? Why don't I try painting it? And I started again, like humanity started. I started with the cave paintings. I really was studying them with the earth colors. And I loved the earth colors, and they were sort of immediately manageable for me. And these things, on the one hand, were a generating force, and the other was because sculpture was so expensive to buy. I was looking for a medium that was less expensive and yet was still fine. And I sort of got into this and really enjoyed it, because it was sort of, again, looking back in history at fresco, and also the process of fresco, because I had started by trying to paint with acrylic paints on the plaster. And what I soon found out is if you do that, you create a skin that will peel off very readily. And so I had to go really back in history and look at how the fresco was painted. And they, as most people know, they were painted on fresh plaster. But maybe what a lot of people don't know is that when they were readjusted or painted over or needed correction, there's a secco process where you paint mixing your powder color with milk, and you paint lime water into the dried fresco, and then you can paint with the milk combined with the pigment into the plaster. And in this particular one being shown, that's Prometheus and Hercules. And I've used Greek vases and telling my own story, which is a Greek mythical relationship. And in that is a carved, the vases are all carved sort of very specifically into the plaster. And then I come back, and by then the plaster is pretty dry. So I use the secco method of painting into the plaster. And it's been very satisfying, and the pieces are relatively heavy because what I do is I build a tray out of a plywood with a mahogany rim, and then I put stainless steel nails into the edge, and then I pour plaster into the tray, and I reinforce it with burlap. And so the whole thing is held together mechanically. But
So George, you've got
works.
classical subjects here. Yeah, it works. You have several classical subjects that we see that as a theme throughout your work, whichever style of sculpture you're working in. I think we have an abstract too. Jen, did we put that into the slideshow? Yeah.
Yeah, this is at the Michener. This was donated to the Michener Museum, which I'm very proud of it being there, and with the other pieces that are there. I think one of the things I've done with the frescoes is I've interrelated vases and cultures and symbols from other cultures, so that what I have found is that both the vases and the cultures and the people that I've brought together in these all get along very well together. And I find that's very pleasing, because I think of that as the biggest, most positive aspect of our country. And I sort of have emulated that in my frescoes.
So George, you're very well known for your nudes. You have an extraordinary ability to convey the human body, particularly the female body. I know while Jen is pulling that up, talk to us a little bit about your studies in anatomy at Dartmouth Medical School.
Well, it's I studied 4 years from life, actually modeling from live models, 2 at the National Academy of Design and 2 at the Art Students League. And then after that, because my parents were connected with Dartmouth College, I was allowed to join medical students and to do a cadaver there. And so I did. 2 medical students worked on one side of the cadaver, and I worked on the other. And it was an amazing insight because there's 3 layers of muscle over bones, and these 3 layers of muscles work in specific manners to move the human body's miraculous and incredible, and it's one thing to model from life and to see the groupings on the surface and see how they work, but when you go into the interior and you see this intricacy, yeah, I'll tell you, I think of Rodin specifically in this context because when he modeled, you almost have a sense of the skin being so immediately over the anatomy. It's remarkable.
So George,
my-
let's talk about some of the specific pieces here. We've got them on 2 different slides, and maybe if Jen can help us, we'll go back and forth. You've got a range here that we selected from different eras in your career. Jen, if we
Right.
can go back to the previous slide, the one on the far left, I believe, was early in your career, George.
Yeah,
The one in the middle, I want to say, if I'm remembering correctly, that's sort of mid-career, but you can see very different styles of sculpture here.
yeah, I think I'm trying to think of what this one was named, but it obviously has to do with growth and development and and aspiration. And this
George,
one,
George,
yeah,
sorry to
yeah.
interrupt. Jen has just posted for us Spring from
Spring,
1980,
yeah,
Nude
yeah.
Undressing 1980. So I have that one
Yeah.
a little bit wrong. And then Awakening 1985. Thanks, Jen.
Thank you. Thank very much, Jen. Yeah, spring. So I was doing a good description. Didn't have the title. That and that was early on. And again, this is pretty derivative in terms of there was a guy who I met who was not who I didn't get along with well, but he was a very great sculptor in the National Sculpture Society. And he did a piece called The Rocket Thrower, and I think it was in front of a major building in Boston. And it had sort of a very violent male figure hurling something into space. And I sort of loved the indication of his figure, but I had a different idea for the same gesture which related to growth and development here. The nude undressing, I was working, I think, in counterbalance probably to the first piece of trying to loosen up and be more intuitive at this stage in my life. And I think this stage of my life also encompassed the creation piece, where I was working more spontaneously and letting the existing piece live in terms of a more obvious sense of the modeling involved, so that a lot of people have enjoyed this piece because of the sense of immediacy of my modeling imprints in the piece, which again, in a way relates back much more to St. Gaudens, to Auguste Rodin than to St. Gaudens. The spring piece would have been much more related to Auguste St. Gaudens, and certainly the awakening piece is again very much in the same period as the nude undressing, and that was a very I like them all, but the awakening And I guess the spring are an idea that I fulfill with the aspirations that you just showed earlier.
Let's move to the next slide, George, and take a and
Yeah.
compare those, because again, these are very different.
Yeah, these are much more, I think I'm more consciously aware of the sensuality in the female figure. And this is, again, the same idea of dawn with the drapery, sort of awakening again. But the figure's much fuller, and I'm much more aware of the flesh of the figure. And that's certainly the case in aspiration. And aspiration really consciously is very, again, derivative insofar as there's a very famous piece by August St. Gaudens, Diana, and she is a fully extended female figure, slender, gorgeous, with a bow. And she's in the Metropolitan Museum of Fine Art. She's in the Philadelphia Museum of Fine Art. And I believe she's in the American Art Museum in Washington, D.C. I'm not sure of that, but I think that's the case. But what I did with her is I made her much more, again, sensual in terms of a fleshy quality. And at the same time, I took away the bow from Diana. And again, it's sort of, she herself is bent like a bow. And it's as if she were pulling her own bow back. But what she's projecting is her own ambition and thoughts of the future and her growth and development. I think when I think of the human figure, it certainly it relates in a lot of different ways, but and certainly my love of the female figure. And here, this is again different. This is called a heroic torso, and I did that. She's in both these pictures, but I did her right in the middle of the civil rights, and I had done a standing black nude just before having done this one. And I think, again, both of them I'm very proud of. And one was really had to do with the beauty, the black, beautiful woman, a slender figure. And she's in the Atlanta Clark Museum in Atlanta, Georgia, which is it's a school, Atlanta Clark School, and that's black predominantly. So I'm very proud of that. And this is at the Berman Museum, and that's a lovely place for it to be also. And the torso in the front is a figure in the process of rising. It's sort of the stomach muscles pulling the upper body up. And it's, again, sort of symbolic of our time and the female movement. I've always dealt with the female figure as not simply an object, a beautiful object, but really a person with imagination and intelligence. And so that on the one hand, it's my own idealization of femininity, but it's also sort of an understanding that as I'm doing this, I have that Pandora's box of humanity behaving poorly. And I think when I think of humanity, I think that we can be more beautiful than anything there is in creation, but we can also be uglier than anything in creation in terms of our capacity for self-destruction.
So
But,
George, you've given a great transition there. We have just a few moments left, and I want to share several more works if we can get to them. So unfortunately, we won't be able to do justice to each of them. But this is at the Michener I set before you this day. Give us a brief background on this piece, and maybe Jen, if we can look at some of the details as George is talking.
I had a Holocaust survivor come to me with the idea in his head that he wanted personified if it could happen. And he had seen my Death and Starvation, and he had seen my Cain and Abel, which is a scene of murder. And he said, because you had done those two things, he thought that I could maybe come up with an idea that related to the people who had risked their lives and their families' lives to save Jews during World War II. And he and I worked together, and the idea was that he would find, if we could work something out that made sense, he would work hard at finding funding to do it. Well, what happened was that I worked with him for a time, and there's letters around that time that we have that really met with a lot of difficulty. And I think it was over the concept of something symbolic of the time. And eventually what I came up with, and this happened really, what happened was he called me and told me that he was having difficulties with his heart and that he was going in for surgery and he may not live. And that's what happened. He died. So I was sort of left with a concept, and it kept eating at me. And what was lodged in my head, Al Ronald was the man's name, was the idea of a symbol. And the symbol became the Buchenwald, starved, near death, if not dead figure in the bottom of the piece. And it is wrapped around an elder statesman's figure, and he has one arm down in an act of defiance and fist, and he's standing and preventing the other people on his side from helping. And on the other side, ranged against him, is a woman and a man. There's actually two men. And the two men, well, let me say, the two men, a child and a woman, create a family. And the two men are, one is facing us and the other is facing the elder statesman. And the man facing the elder statesman has the gesture of openness in his confrontation. And between them is a man like himself, only he has the Jewish star on his coat and his clothes are tattered. And he is handing off his daughter to a woman beside and reaching out to take the child to her. And ranged behind the elder is a woman with a child, and she is protecting the child and turning from helping, but at the same time making the child see what's happening. And
So George,
and then the last couple is they're submerging themselves into each other and not participate, trying not to participate. Sorry, Laura.
no, I apologize for interrupting you. It's a powerful piece, and I think Jen had up there the dedication at, if I'm not wrong, at the Michener, and also
Yes,
I think
yeah.
it was, is this at the Capitol, the U.S. Capitol?
No, this is right out inside of the Michener.
Okay.
years ago.
Okay.
Oh, the second picture is in the Cannon Building at the Capitol. The Hankins bought the sculpture and currently own it, but it's on loan at the Michener. And but Peter Kostemeyer, who was our congressman at the time, was able to get a viewing of the piece in the Cannon Building. And not only that, he got endorsements from a whole lot of congressional people, among them John Lewis, who I met, which is a great honor. And I got there's a pamphlet, a lovely pamphlet that the Hankins sponsored, and it has in there a number of real compliments on the piece from these people.
It's an extraordinary piece, George. We're bumping up against the time, but I can't go away without taking a look at the caryatid. Jen, if we could go quickly through that. It's an extraordinary sculpture. I think it's more optimistic. So we want to start with, we want to leave with a more upbeat image. Obviously, I think also it's nice, George, because it's a classical reference again. So it goes back to your classical training, your academic training, and yet it's a very modern take on it.
Thank you, Laura. It's if not my favorite, it's one of my favorite pieces. And it is, again, really where I think intuitively I got out in front of myself, because I had done a small piece, very small piece, 9 inches tall. And it was a piece in a competition that I won. And the competition was to make an award to hand out to the Bucks County Volunteer of the Year. And that in itself, the piece that I did was given out for 10 years with a new casting each year for that volunteer. And aside from meeting a lot of extraordinary people who spent a large part of their lives really helping others, it really embedded in my mind. I had used quotes from John Donne, for whom the bell tolls for you. I mean, it's your responsibility. We're all one group of people. And I sort of linked that with our own civil rights situation. But what I've done is I've taken this heroic woman who bears the burden of the bell of John Donne, but also Martin Luther King, Let Freedom Ring. It also has to do with the idea of individual responsibility, that the bell she bears is for eternity. And the bell she bears is maybe symbolic of our democracy and the responsibility of each of us to be responsible in terms of our Declaration of Independence and Constitution. And and certainly, again, here we are in a dilemma dealing directly with that situation.
Well, certainly relevance for our time. Unfortunately, we're out of time right now, but I'd like to give the last question to our audience member, who I think has an excellent summation question, Jen.
Yes, Richard wants to know, George, what would you like for your legacy to be through your art?
Oh my. I would love, aside from what has happened, is we're supposed to theoretically have a retrospective in 2024 at the Michener. And I would love to see that be a success with a book attached to it that pulls all these different things together. I think it's so interesting because I've been so fortunate, but to see things tied together in that manner would be a great boon to me and to my family and to my family's family, forever.
George Anthonisen, sir, thank you so very much for spending time with us. And as much as we appreciate your work, through looking at it, it's a real pleasure to have you talk about it and your inspirations. So thank you for your time this evening.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. It's always
George
rewarding.
George Anthonisen is the Phillips Mills Honored Artist for 2021. He'll be unveiling a new work at this year's show, which opens in a month. And artists out there, please get your submissions in before September 3rd. The next Art Talk is in 3 weeks. We're postponing by 1 week in recognition of the Mills Lathrop Circle event. When we return on September 19th, we will not actually have an artist. I think that's the first time on Art Talk that we don't have an artist. David Rago of Rago Auction House in Lambertville will talk to us about how to build an art collection. That's another conversation I've been looking forward to for a long time, and I hope you all can join us. Thank you for joining us today. We love having you here with us for Phillips Mill Art Talk. Jen McHugh is our executive producer. Special thanks today to Ellen Antonison. I'm Laura Womack.